Ah, the Metroidvania genre. Just what is Metroidvania? Well, it's a style of platform game which is characterized by having a large, persistent game world rather than a game broken up into stages or chapters. The name is a portmanteau of Metroid, and if you don't know what Metroid is, I really feel sorry for you, and Castlevania, specifically referring to the Symphony of the Night style of games rather than the older games which followed a Mario format. These games tend to have a number of unique traits compared to other platformers. They do tend to be longer than other games of the genre, and almost always have some form of save feature. The characters are upgradable, and parts of the overworld will always unlock with upgrades or more progress. For example, in Super Metroid, as you earn power-ups, you could open new doors, jump to new heights, roll into a ball into small spaces, and so on. So your characters are upgradable. While modern games of this style generally like to hold your hand through gameplay, pointing you where you have to go, older games required constant memorization of areas to know where to return to once you got your new power and ability. You would get a new power-up and then say, where did I see this before? Where can I use this to access a new area? Games of this genre include Super Metroid, Symphony of the Night, Blaster Master, and the Mega Man Zero and ZX series, and they're almost always held in very high regard. The game worlds are always intricately crafted mazes, but despite the programmer's best efforts, there's always a small chance that an entrepreneur and gamer might find a way to sequence break the game. This is extremely popular with the Metroid series, where power-ups can be earned out of sequence and change the complete gameplay style. Gamers seeking an extra challenge might use this to actually skip power-ups, making the game harder for themselves. So just what is a valley without wind? Well, most of New Brunswick. Actually, no. A valley without wind is a procedurally generated Metroidvania. What this effectively means is as you proceed into new areas, each area is produced not by a level designer, but by an algorithm. Come to think of it, pretty much the entire game is procedurally generated. Enemies upgrade based on general templates and traits chosen at random, bosses are randomly generated, the world map is randomly generated, your power-ups are randomly generated, your characters are randomly generated. Think Diablo, but as a platformer. Now, there's a lot to admire about this. It's a very hard thing to do to make an entire game procedurally generated. So the developers really tried to make a game that would present unlimited challenge to the player, an infinite world to explore. The graphics are crisp and colorful, character animation is fluid, the sound effects are adequate. They really tried their best and it shows, and some parts of the game really shine with it. But unfortunately, the very same things that we admire technically are some of its worst qualities. What made Super Metroid one of the greatest games of its era wasn't the fact that it had an enormous world map. It was that the world map was woven so intricately. Secrets abounded everywhere, and everything felt like it was placed in a very organic world for a purpose. Because everything is procedurally generated in a valley without wind, the layout is anything but organic. Every region looks and feels more or less the same. Ground littered with rises and ravines without rhyme or reason. Every building is more or less the same. Even the bosses are generally more or less the same. Take a look at this big guy right here. Sure, he looks intimidating, but he's actually just a larger version of the average grunt we've been fighting for this entire area. Bosses may shoot faster or be larger or deal more damage, but they lack the uniqueness of, say, Mother Brain, Kraid, or Ridley, not to keep using Super Metroid. While there are upgrades, none of which really stand out because they're as randomly generated as the environment. You can find a fireball, or a different kind of fireball, or maybe a feather fall that reduces your jumping damage, but these are all statistical. There's nothing like the grappling beam, for instance, or the X-ray visor, or the screw attack, anything that really stands out above and beyond, I'm shooting you, or I'm shooting you a different way, and that's unfortunate. Once you realize this, the infinite world starts to become very boring. And what's worse than this is that the developer actually admits this by highlighting the important rooms for you and crossing off the dead-end rooms. What follows here is a quote directly from their frequently asked questions on their website. First of all, talk about a yawn fest. AVWW isn't scaled to real life, but it's also scaled larger than most games. This is great because it gives you a sense of being in a real world that is actually of sufficient scope to be interesting to explore. It was also important to us to have the general rule, if you can see it, you can go there. That means that if there's a bunch of houses in a town, well, you can go into each one. But who in their right mind wants to wander through 60 houses? Here's the cool thing. We made it really easy for you to tell which houses you have not been into. and inside almost every building there is at least one stash room with some supplies that you desperately need. And you can see these stash rooms in a nice yellow node on your dungeon map. So this makes the looting actually about efficiency rather than completionism. Your goal isn't to get everything in every area, because frankly you cannot. There are not enough hours in the day, even if you quit your job. Most players also hate locked doors that you can't go into for mysterious reasons, unless the game you're playing is survival horror, in which case it's a relief every time, but that's a very different genre. Our solution was to let you go into any room, but to destroy some of them. We make them obviously destroyed just from looking at their entrance, and make it so that they never have anything of interest at all inside them. Repeat, there is never anything of interest to find in destroyed rooms, which means that you can safely ignore them as you explore around. So where does this leave us? Well, we know that every area contains a multitude of exploration, nearly infinite areas, all of which are filled with mechanically generated areas, enemies, and quests. Moreover, even the developers say that 99% of the game is pointless filler. Not all procedurally generated games are like this. Minecraft creates random areas for exploration as well, but there's always a reward for doing so. The next block you go past might contain diamond, coal, or some other hidden reward. Diablo ushers you on with the next bit of loot and the promise of a boss. Here, the reward feels empty, and the only reward for slogging through it is to kill a boss that's usually a clone of an enemy you've already fought, or could fight somewhere else, just so that you can do it all over again. There's never any cool item, no sense of accomplishment. Even if you do manage to kill the overlord of an area, the final boss of that zone, your reward, is to start over on a new continent with more random layout, items, characters, and so on. So we have an exploration game in which there's a disincentive to explore everything. In the end, we never really feel attached to the game world, which is a shame given how much work was put into the game. But alright, so you can't feel emotionally attached to the world. What about your character? Well, as the game creation screen reminds us, death is an eventuality. Your character is a glyph bearer, who is somebody who has a very short life expectancy for having the unique ability for being able to go outside and do things, and wield magic power and all that. When he dies, his power simply transfers 100% to the next Joe Schmuck that takes his place. Making this reality worse, there's a high probability that your vengeful ghost will remain on that map forever to haunt and attack you the next time you approach it. And this isn't something that goes away. If you've died in an area, he's there until you kill your ghost. Now, whatever was on that map killed you the first time, so the game's solution is to make it harder by introducing another difficult obstacle to the map. How is this good gameplay mechanics? Actually, let's harp on gameplay mechanics just a bit more for a moment. I was one of the early adopters of the game, and when I first played the game, there were things called civilization points. CP for short were earned by completing the missions that made your settlement grow, building a windmill, finding a survivor, that kind of thing. When you completed 5 missions and got 5 of these points, the level of the continent you were on went up by 1. The enemies grow more difficult, and enemies started spreading to adjacent squares. A junkyard enemy might show up in the abandoned town beside it, and so on. Kind of a neat feature. Now, by more difficult, I unfortunately don't mean that they became more advanced or interesting. They just gained more HP, more damage, and maybe a projectile attack. So, neat idea in theory, but bad in execution. What's worse, though, is that in order to level up your spells, you had to have a specific tier orb. When your civilization level was 2, you could get level 2 orbs that would allow you to have level 2 spells. The problem here, though, is that these tier orbs aren't backwards compatible. If you go to level 3 and start earning level 3 orbs, there's no way to go back and get level 2 orbs. You can be stuck with level 1 spells simply because you leveled too high to upgrade them. There is a way to dilute level orbs, but this is incredibly complicated. If it sounds complicated, it's because it is. The game has an entire encyclopedia devoted to the various things that you can do in it, and a handy checklist for keeping you on track with the things it expects to get done. But back to the general topic of gameplay mechanics. At the time that I played it, leveling up was done by finding various shards that you could spend in upgrades. These upgrades were then lost when you died and didn't transfer over to the next character. I stopped playing the game for a while, and when I came back later to do this review, I found that the entire gameplay mechanic had changed. There was no more CP, the way that you built structures had changed, even the way that you leveled up had become different. What the hell? You can't just change gameplay mechanics mid-stride. It's like if Final Fantasy VII, and after its release Squaresoft comes out and says, you know, Materia was a mistake. Let's patch in a job system. I can appreciate that they listened to the community when they said that this wasn't working, but these are things that get squashed out in playtesting. We're not talking about Minecraft, where the game was crowdsourced as a beta. We're talking about the final release product. This sort of thing is still going on with the game today too. When I started finishing the footage that I was collecting, the game started mentioning my lack of food for the peons that lived in my settlement. Well, of course they were starving, because up until this point you haven't actually had food for them to eat. All in all, I can appreciate what was attempted with A Valley Without Wind, and I respect the developer for trying. Making a game procedurally generated on this level takes a lot of programming skill, and you can see in the graphics and the sound that the production values are very high, especially on the higher settings. Unfortunately, the game ended up being too barren of purpose to be really interesting. You know from the outset that you will never run into traps in an environment, intricately crafted boss encounters, or even character development. The rewards you do find feel hollow and hardly worth the effort. All in all, while I applaud the effort and the technical prowess put into the game's development, it's a concept that just doesn't work well, and the developer knows it. It's why the game is undergoing such radical changes. And for that reason, I really have to give the game an A-. With that being said, a few more updates in the game might feature a Guardian Scroll that builds a hockey rink, so you never know what is possible. The game has improved since it came out, so it might be worth revisiting this one from time to time, just to see if some of these issues are actually resolved. In the meantime though, it's not really worth picking up. Until next time, this is A+ Gamer signing out.